For over a decade now, trade agreements have become about so much more than trade, right? I mean, if the TPP were simply about stuff like, well, what are tariffs? What about quotas? And that is partly what it's about. It wouldn't nearly be as dangerous, actually, as it is in reality, right? The TPP and other trade agreements that are based really on a US model of trade and investment agreements are really about corporate power, about increasing the power of corporations over our economic and political lives. It's about pushing an international agenda of deregulation in favor of corporations and against the public interests. In the context of the TPP, and this is, I think, what many panelists will be talking about later, it is also about expanding US hegemony, for example, throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So, a couple of things: corporate power, deregulation, US hegemony. I'm sure that, in fact, I will open up the floor now. What else are these international trade agreements about? Anyone want to throw out? Hilton Hotels. Ramada Inn. Okay, others, yes. About corporate sovereignty. What else?
Destroying the earth for oil.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Yeah, genetically modified, yeah, and genetic engineering, that's for sure. Okay, see, this is why we have a great movement. It's an informed movement, and so trade agreements are about all of these things, right? It's not just about, lowering quotas or tariffs, or increasing quotas or lowering tariffs or whatever. And so when I was in a conversation earlier this week about why is Friends of the Earth concerned about the TPP, I think that people expected me to say, well, it's because it will simply increase the flow of trade in goods that are produced in environmentally and socially impactful ways. So, for example, we know that a lot of the countries that are involved in the TPP right now, for example, Peru and Australia and Chile, mining is really, really huge. We heard from Rosa just today about the effects of mega mining projects in Papua New Guinea, and ocean dumping of tailings. So all kinds of environmental issues associated, right, with minerals mining, acid mine drainage, and the poisoning of water, and of course, where there are indigenous peoples and local peoples around, it can devastate livelihoods. So yes, part of the impact of the TPP will be an increase probably in big mining operations. It will probably also mean an increase in palm oil expansion. We heard from Gemma earlier today that, and from Anyarata, that there is a real close correlation between land grabbing, the acquisition of massive, massive pieces of land in order to create these plantations, right? And we also know that when we think palm oil plantation, we have to think in the US about cotton plantations and the plantations of the South, and everything that we feel when we think about that, we have to know that that's what we're talking about when we talk about plantations. We talk about exploitation, right? So we know that the increase in this in trade in palm oil means the increase in these social and human rights and environmental abuses, and we know that the TPP is going to open up more of that. But really, it's the U.S. model of trade and investment agreements that the TPP embodies. It's that super rights that are granted to corporations, which may form the even bigger threat to the environment. And we had Arthur talk a little bit about these investor-state trade, the investor-state dispute mechanisms. And these are these special trade courts which allow multinational corporations, foreign corporations, when they operate in a country, to actually sue sovereign governments for environmental, social, public health regulations that they believe present such an onerous burden on them that they do not make as much profit as they were expecting to make. So they can actually sue to essentially regain the costs of complying with emerging environmental public health, public interest regulations. And even their expected future profit is considered their property. And if public health or environmental regulation, we're talking about tobacco labeling, we're talking about regulations around pesticides and around chemicals, we're talking about all of these regulations that are meant to protect human health and the environment. If those end up somehow impacting the ability of a multinational corporation to make as much money as it thought it was going to make, well, then you can go to these special trade tribunals and recoup your losses, so to speak. It's a way to kind of cut the legs out from underneath the struggles of communities and indigenous peoples and movements around the world who hold corporations accountable. And it also cuts the legs out from under governments themselves to contemplate proper environmental and public health regulation, right? If you're a small country and you could be potentially sued billions of dollars by some corporation who says that your public health law or your environmental law is going to impact my profit, so I'm going to take you to court. As a policymaker, it could have a chilling effect, what's called a chilling effect. You'd be so scared that you could essentially ruin your country's budget that you would maybe think twice about enacting the kinds of environmental and public health regulations that are really needed. So these are the kinds of real threats, I think, that are posed to the environment, to human rights, to indigenous rights. It's not just the increase in the stuff and the environmental and social impacts of more stuff and more trade in stuff, but it is about really the ability of us as citizens to hold our governments accountable and for governments to actually regulate in the public interest.